A little girl, just 8 years old, stands alone on a desolate, snow-covered highway. The biting wind cuts through her thin jacket, and the falling snow begins to bury her small footprints. Hours ago, her stepmother promised to return with help, but she never came back. Now, Ruth whispers into the growing darkness, "Someone will come soon," as her numb fingers clutch her jacket tighter. Just as the weight of despair begins to sink in, a voice slices through the howling storm, calling her name. Who's out there, hope, or something far worse? Stay tuned to find out, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Ruth's small fingers had long since gone numb from the biting cold. At 8 years old, she couldn't understand why her stepmother had driven her to this desolate stretch of highway, told her to wait by the guardrail, and promised to return with help for their broken-down car. That had been hours ago, before the snow began to fall in earnest, before the sun had started its descent behind the mountains of northern Montana. "Someone will come soon," she whispered to herself, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. The words formed clouds in the frigid air, disappearing into the growing darkness. Her stepmother, Dorothy, had been acting strangely all week, ever since the argument with Ruth's father before he left for his business trip to Seattle. Ruth had overheard fragments of their heated discussion. "I never signed up to be a mother, and she reminds me too much of her." The memory of her real mother was growing fainter with each passing year. Sometimes, Ruth would sit in front of her mother's old vanity mirror, trying to find traces of her in her own reflection, the same honey-brown eyes, the subtle curve of their shared smile. But today, huddled against the metal guardrail as snowflakes caught in her dark hair, Ruth couldn't summon even that faint connection. Look, could this mysterious voice be her salvation or a chilling trap? A truck rumbled past, its headlights briefly illuminating her small figure before disappearing into the swirling snow. Ruth had tried waving at the few vehicles that passed, but the combination of falling snow and gathering dusk made her nearly invisible from the road. Her legs ached from standing, but the ground was too cold and wet to sit. The day had started normally enough. Dorothy had picked her up from school, something she rarely did, usually leaving that task to Mrs. Peterson from next door. "We're going on a little trip," Dorothy had said, her voice carrying an edge Ruth hadn't recognized. "How?" "Your father called, we're meeting him." It hadn't made sense, Dad wasn't due back for 3 more days. But Ruth had climbed into the car anyway, clutching her backpack with her homework still inside. They'd driven for hours, far beyond the familiar streets of their small town, past fields and forests that gradually gave way to mountains. Ruth had dozed off at some point, waking to find them pulled over on this stretch of highway, the car having trouble, Dorothy had explained, her eyes not meeting Ruth's. "Wait here while I walk to get help, don't move from this spot." That had been when the sun was still high in the sky. Now, as darkness crept in and the temperature continued to drop, Ruth began to understand with growing clarity that Dorothy wasn't coming back. The realization settled over her like the accumulating snow, cold, heavy, and impossible to shake off. A sob caught in her throat as she remembered her father's last words before his trip, "Be good for Dorothy, princess. I'll bring you back something special." Would he know where to find her? Would he understand what had happened when he returned to an empty house? The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally now, each flake stinging against her exposed skin. Ruth tucked her hands into her armpits, trying to preserve what little warmth remained in her body. Her school shoes, not meant for winter weather, were soaked through, and she could no longer feel her toes. Time became meaningless as the storm intensified. Ruth's world narrowed to the small space around the guardrail, everything beyond lost in the white curtain of snow. Her thoughts began to drift, memories mixing with the present moment in a hazy blur. She thought of her last birthday, when Dad had made her favorite chocolate cake. She remembered the way her mother used to sing her to sleep, though she could no longer recall the tune. Then, cutting through the howling wind and her increasingly foggy thoughts, she heard something that made her heart skip a beat, a voice carried on the wind, calling what sounded like her name, Ruth. She lifted her head, uncertain if the voice was real or a product of her cold-addled mind. The snow swirled around her, creating ghostly shapes in the gathering darkness. Was someone really out there, or was her desperate mind playing tricks on her? Ruth, is someone there? The voice came again, clearer this time, unmistakably real. Ruth opened her mouth to respond, but her voice caught in her throat, hoarse from hours of crying and cold. She summoned what little strength remained in her frozen body and tried again. Help, she managed to call out, the word barely more than a whisper. I'm here. The voice grew closer, accompanied by the crunch of boots on snow-covered ground. Ruth tried to move toward the sound, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The hours of standing in the cold had left them stiff and unresponsive. She squinted through the swirling snow, desperate to catch a glimpse of her potential rescuer. Over here, she called again, her voice slightly stronger this time. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth across the snowy landscape. Ruth raised one trembling hand, waving it weakly. The light found her, illuminating her small figure against the guardrail. Oh my God, a woman's voice gasped. The sound of running footsteps followed, and suddenly there was warmth, human warmth, as strong arms wrapped around her. You poor thing, you're freezing. The woman quickly shrugged off her heavy coat and wrapped it around Ruth. In the beam of the flashlight, Ruth could see her rescuer's face, kind eyes creased with worry, gray hair escaping from beneath a wool hat. The woman looked to be around the same age as Ruth's grandmother would have been. I'm Margaret, the woman said, rubbing Ruth's arms to generate warmth. I live just up the road. I was driving home when I thought I saw something by the guardrail, but I wasn't sure in all this snow. Had to come back to check. She peered at Ruth's face. What's your name, sweetheart? How long have you been out here? Ruth, she managed through chattering teeth. My stepmom, she left me here. She said she was getting help, but fresh tears froze on her cheeks. Margaret's face hardened for a moment before softening again. Let's get you somewhere warm. My house is just a few minutes away. She helped Ruth to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they made their way to an old blue pickup truck idling on the shoulder, its headlights cutting through the storm. The truck's cab was gloriously warm. Ruth held her numb hands in front of the heater vents as Margaret pulled back onto the highway, driving slowly through the worsening storm. We need to call the police, Margaret said, glancing at Ruth, and get you checked out by a doctor. But first, let's get you warmed up and fed. Feeling began to return to her extremities, bringing with it painful pins and needles. Ruth's mind drifted back to earlier times, before Dorothy had entered their lives, back when it was just her and Dad making the best of things after Mom died. They'd had a good routine. Dad would help her with homework in the evenings, they'd make dinner together, and weekends were for adventures, hiking, visiting museums, or just playing board games when the weather was bad. Everything had changed 2 years ago when Dad started dating Dorothy. She'd seemed nice enough at first, always bringing Ruth little gifts and suggesting fun outings. But after the wedding, the mask had slipped. Dorothy's smile became strained, her patience shorter. She began finding reasons to leave the room whenever Ruth entered, to be busy whenever Ruth needed help with something. My house isn't much, Margaret's voice brought Ruth back to the present, but it's warm and dry. They were turning onto a narrow road that wound through dense pine trees. Snow had drifted across parts of the road, but Margaret navigated it skillfully, as if she'd driven this route 1,000 times before. A small log cabin emerged from the darkness, smoke curling from its chimney. Through the windows, Ruth could see the warm glow of lights. It looked like something from a Christmas card, cozy, welcoming, safe. Inside, the cabin was even warmer than it appeared. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. Margaret immediately set about getting Ruth out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in thick blankets and settling her in front of the fire. I'll make you some hot chocolate, she said, and then we need to make some calls. As Margaret moved around the kitchen, Ruth took in her surroundings. The cabin's walls were lined with bookshelves, and framed photographs covered nearly every available surface. Many showed children of various ages, some recent, others faded with time. Ruth's attention was caught by one photo in particular, a group shot of about a dozen kids with Margaret in the center, all of them smiling broadly at the camera. "Those are my kids," Margaret said, following Ruth's gaze as she returned with a steaming mug of hot chocolate. "Well, not technically mine. I've been a foster mother for 30 years now." She settled into an armchair across from Ruth. "Some stayed for a few weeks, others for years. Each one was special in their own way." Ruth wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. "Do any of them still live with you?" "Not at the moment," Margaret replied, something sad flickering across her face. "My last foster child moved on to a permanent home 6 months ago. Been pretty quiet here since then." She paused, studying Ruth with those kind eyes. "Which is why I was out driving tonight, truth be told. Sometimes when it's too quiet, I just need to get out for a bit." The hot chocolate was rich and sweet, with tiny marshmallows floating on top. As Ruth sipped it, she felt warmth spreading through her body, chasing away the last of the bone-deep cold. But with physical comfort came the full emotional weight of what had happened. Dorothy had abandoned her, really, truly abandoned her. "Why?" and the question escaped before Ruth could stop it, her voice cracking. "Why would she leave me there?" Margaret set down her own mug and leaned forward. "Sometimes people do terrible things because they're hurting inside. It doesn't make it right. Nothing could make what she did right, but it's not because of anything you did, Ruth. You understand that?" Before Ruth could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Margaret rose quickly, moving to answer it. Through the window, Ruth could see the red and blue lights of a police car reflecting off the falling snow. "That'll be Officer Jenkins," Margaret said. "I called while you were warming up. We need to find your father, Ruth. Do you know where he is?" Ruth nodded, but fear suddenly gripped her heart. What if they couldn't reach Dad? What if Dorothy had done something to him too? The mug trembled in her hands as Margaret opened the door, revealing a tall police officer stamping snow from his boots on the porch. Officer Jenkins removed his snow-covered hat as he entered the cabin, revealing a weathered face lined with concern. His uniform was dusted with snow, and he carried a thick manila folder under his arm. Behind him, a woman in plain clothes followed. She introduced herself as Ms. Watson from Child Protective Services. "Ruth," Officer Jenkins knelt down to her level, his voice gentle, "I'm going to need to ask you some questions about what happened today. Is that okay?" Ruth nodded, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Margaret sat beside her on the couch, a steady, reassuring presence. "Can you tell me about when your stepmother left you on the highway?" Ruth recounted the events of the day, the unexpected pickup from school, the long drive, Dorothy's strange behavior, and the abandonment. As she spoke, Officer Jenkins took notes, occasionally exchanging glances with Ms. Watson. "We've been trying to reach your father," Ms. Watson said when Ruth finished. "The number listed for his workplace goes to voicemail. Do you know which hotel he's staying at in Seattle?" Ruth shook her head. "He usually calls to tell me, but," her voice trailed off as a horrible thought struck her. What if he's not really in Seattle? What if Dorothy lied about that too? The adults exchanged loaded glances. Officer Jenkins pulled out his phone and stepped into the kitchen, speaking in low tones. Ruth could catch fragments of his conversation: possible missing person, business trip to Seattle, need to verify. Ms. Watson sat forward in her chair. "Ruth, has Dorothy ever done anything like this before, or shown any signs that she might?" Ruth thought about it, memories surfacing like bubbles in still water. "She's been different lately, angry a lot. She and Dad were fighting before he left. She hesitated, then added, I heard her say she never wanted to be a mother. Margaret's hand found Ruth's shoulder, squeezing gently. You're very brave to tell us all this. Officer Jenkins returned, his face grim. I just spoke with Seattle PD. They're sending officers to check the major hotels, but, he paused, choosing his words carefully, we've also discovered something concerning. Dorothy withdrew a large amount of money from your father's account 2 days ago, and she purchased a plane ticket to Buenos Aires that departed this afternoon. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Ruth felt Margaret's arm tighten around her shoulders, anchoring her to reality. But what about Dad? She whispered. We're doing everything we can to locate him, Officer Jenkins assured her. In the meantime, we need to discuss temporary arrangements for Ruth's care. Ms. Watson nodded. Normally, we'd look for relatives first. Ruth, do you have any grandparents or aunts and uncles nearby? No, Ruth said quietly. Mom's parents died before I was born, and Dad's family all live in Australia. We visited them once, but that was years ago. Margaret cleared her throat. I'm a licensed foster parent, as you can see from all the photos. My home is currently approved and empty. If it would help, she left the offer hanging in the air. Ms. Watson's face brightened slightly. That could be an excellent temporary solution, assuming Ruth is comfortable with it. She turned to Ruth. Would you be okay staying here with Margaret for a little while, just until we can locate your father? Ruth looked around the cozy cabin, at the wall of photos showing happy children, at Margaret's kind face. It wasn't home, but it felt safe. She nodded. I'll need to make some calls to expedite the emergency placement, Ms. Watson said, standing. And we'll need to get some clothes and personal items for Ruth. Officer Jenkins, could you send a unit to the house to? She was interrupted by the sharp trill of Officer Jenkins' phone. He answered it, listening intently, his expression changing from concern to alarm when he asked sharply, and you're certain? Another pause. No, don't touch anything. We'll have forensics there within the hour. He ended the call and turned to the room, his face grave. That was Seattle police. They just found Mr. Anderson's car in long-term parking at SeaTac Airport. The security cameras showed Dorothy parking it there 3 days ago. He took a deep breath. There's more. When they checked the trunk, they found signs of. He glanced at Ruth, clearly struggling with how much to say in front of her. Perhaps we should discuss this in the kitchen, Margaret suggested firmly, starting to rise. But Ruth grabbed her hand. Please, she said, her voice small but determined. I need to know. Where is my dad? Officer Jenkins looked at Ms. Watson, who gave a slight nod. He sat down again, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The trunk of the car showed signs of a struggle, Ruth, and we found traces of blood. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as Ruth processed Officer Jenkins' words, blood, her father's blood. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, too everything. Her chest tightened as the implications crashed over her like waves. I think, Margaret said firmly, breaking the heavy silence, that we all need some tea. She squeezed Ruth's shoulder before standing. And maybe some of those chocolate chip cookies I baked yesterday. While Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, Ms. Watson sat next to Ruth on the couch. I know this is overwhelming, she said softly. Would you like to talk about it, or would you prefer to just sit quietly for a while? Ruth stared at her hands, which had begun trembling again despite the warmth of the cabin. I want to help find my dad, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There has to be something I can do. Officer Jenkins leaned forward. Actually, there might be. Can you think of anything unusual that happened in the days before your father's trip? Any conversations you overheard, changes in Dorothy's behavior, places she might have gone? Ruth closed her eyes, trying to focus through the fog of fear and exhaustion. Dorothy was on the phone a lot, she remembered, late at night when she thought I was asleep. I could hear her walking around downstairs. She paused, another memory surfacing. And she cleaned out the garage last week. She said she was organizing, but she filled up our trash can with papers and stuff. Officer Jenkins was taking notes again. Did you notice what kind of papers? No, but, Ruth hesitated, I saw her burning some in the fireplace one night. Dad never lets us burn paper in there, he says it's bad for the chimney. When I asked her about it, she got really angry. Margaret returned with a tray of tea and cookies, passing them around. The familiar, comforting scent helped ground Ruth in the present moment. She took a small sip of tea, letting its warmth spread through her chest. There's something else, she added, the tea giving her courage. The night before Dad left, I heard them fighting about money. Dorothy was saying something about investments and losses. Dad kept saying, we'll figure it out, but not like this. Officer Jenkins and Ms. Watson exchanged significant looks. Ruth, Ms. Watson said gently, we've learned that Dorothy may have been involved in some financial irregularities. She seems to have been moving money around between different accounts. You mean stealing? Ruth asked, her voice small. We're still investigating, Officer Jenkins said diplomatically, but it appears she may have been planning this for some time. He stood up, checking his phone. I need to update the investigation team. They're executing a search warrant at your house right now. As he stepped outside to make his calls, Ruth felt the weight of everything crushing down on her. Her entire world had unraveled in less than a day. Her stepmother had abandoned her to die in a snowstorm, her father was missing, possibly, she couldn't even complete the thought. Margaret seemed to sense her spiraling thoughts. Why don't we get you settled in the guest room, she suggested. It's been a long day, and you need rest. Everything looks a bit clearer in the morning light. Ruth nodded numbly, allowing Margaret to guide her down a short hallway to a cozy bedroom. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a patchwork quilt covered the bed. A wooden dresser stood against one wall, and a small desk sat beneath a window that looked out into the snowy night. I'll find you something to sleep in, Margaret said, opening the dresser. I keep clothes of different sizes for emergencies, one of the many habits you develop as a foster parent. She pulled out a soft flannel nightgown. This should work for tonight. Tomorrow, we can see about getting some of your own things. As Ruth changed into the nightgown, her mind wandered to her own room at home, her stuffed animals, her books, her mother's old jewelry box that Dad had given her for her last birthday. Would she ever see any of it again? A sharp knock at the front door made both Ruth and Margaret jump. They heard Officer Jenkins answering it, followed by urgent voices in the living room. Stay here, Margaret said. I'll go see what's happening. But Ruth couldn't stay put. As soon as Margaret left the room, she crept to the doorway, straining to hear the conversation in the living room. The new voice belonged to a woman, another police officer, based on the technical terms she was using. Security footage from 3 different cameras, the woman was saying, and we can track her movements through the airport. She wasn't alone. What do you mean, wasn't alone? Officer Jenkins asked sharply. The footage shows her meeting a man at the coffee shop before going through security. We're running facial recognition now, but here's where it gets interesting. He wasn't on the flight to Buenos Aires, he took a different flight to Vancouver. Ruth's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear the rest of the conversation, but one phrase cut through clearly, we found his rental car, and there's evidence that Robert Anderson was inside it. Ruth's knees buckled, and she grabbed the doorframe for support. The movement must have made a sound, because suddenly all conversation in the living room stopped. She heard footsteps approaching, and Margaret appeared in the hallway, her face lined with concern. But before either of them could speak, Officer Jenkins' radio crackled to life with an urgent message. All units, be advised, we have a possible sighting of Dorothy Anderson at the Canadian border. Subject may be armed. Approach with extreme caution. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of police activity, phone calls, and mounting tension. Margaret's cozy cabin had become an impromptu command center for the investigation, with officers coming and going despite the continuing snowstorm. Ruth dozed fitfully on the couch, refusing to retreat to the bedroom, afraid she might miss some crucial piece of information about her father. Around dawn, she awoke to urgent voices in the kitchen. Pretending to still be asleep, she listened as Officer Jenkins spoke in low tones with another detective. "The Vancouver angle is looking more solid," the new voice was saying. "We've identified the man from the airport footage. Arthur Morrison, former investment banker, lost his license 3 years ago for fraud." "Any connection to Dorothy Anderson?" "That's where it gets interesting. We pulled Dorothy's phone records. She's been in contact with Morrison for months. But here's the kicker, they worked at the same investment firm 15 years ago, before she changed her name." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. Changed her name? You're telling me Dorothy Anderson isn't her real name? No, she was born Elizabeth Morrison, Arthur's sister. The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. Dorothy, or Elizabeth, wasn't just working with this man, they were family. Everything had been a lie, right from the start. "What about Robert Anderson?" Officer Jenkins asked. "Any sign of him?" "Nothing concrete yet, but we found something disturbing in the rental car. Prescription bottles, heavy sedatives, the kind that would keep someone unconscious but stable for transport." Ruth couldn't stay quiet any longer. She sat up, causing both officers to turn toward her in surprise. "You think they took my dad somewhere?" Her voice cracked on the word dad. Officer Jenkins moved quickly to her side. "Ruth, I'm sorry you had to hear that. We're doing everything we can to find him." Margaret emerged from the hallway, looking like she hadn't slept either. "I think it's time we all had some breakfast," she said firmly. "You can't think straight on an empty stomach." But before she could reach the kitchen, there was a commotion outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, and multiple car doors slammed. A moment later, a sharp knock at the door made everyone jump. The detective who'd been speaking with Officer Jenkins opened it, revealing another officer, his face flushed with excitement. "We've got her. Dorothy Anderson, or Elizabeth Morrison, is in custody. Border Patrol picked her up trying to cross at a remote checkpoint." Hope surged through Ruth. "What about my dad? Did they find him?" The officer's expression sobered. "No, but we found this in her possession." He held up an evidence bag containing a familiar leather wallet. Ruth recognized it immediately, it was her father's. "There's something else," the officer continued, his eyes moving to Officer Jenkins. "She's asking to make a deal, says she'll tell us where Robert Anderson is, but only if we guarantee her immunity." Ruth stood up so quickly she felt dizzy. "You have to find out, please. She knows where my dad is." "It's not that simple," Officer Jenkins said gently. "We can't trust her to tell the truth, even with a deal. She might be trying to buy time while her brother moves your father." Margaret's arm wrapped around Ruth's shoulders, steadying her. "What about the brother? Any sign of him?" "Nothing yet, but we've got alerts out across the Pacific Northwest. Every airport, train station, and border crossing is watching for him." Ruth's mind was racing. Something was tugging at her memory, something important. "Wait," she said suddenly. The cabin. Everyone turned to look at her. "What cabin, Ruth?" Officer Jenkins asked intently. "Last month, Dorothy Elizabeth was looking at real estate websites. I saw her quickly close the tab when I came into the room, but I remember seeing pictures of a cabin. She said she was just dreaming about vacation homes, but Ruth closed her eyes, concentrating. It was somewhere near Vancouver. She left the real estate flyer in her desk drawer. I saw it when I was looking for scissors. The room erupted into activity. Officers were immediately on their phones, calling in the new lead. Ruth could hear fragments of conversations: real estate transactions in the Vancouver area, check for purchases under both names, Morrison family connections. Hours passed in intense waiting. Ruth barely touched the breakfast Margaret made, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to eat. Around noon, Officer Jenkins received a call that made him stand up straight, his face lighting up with purpose. They found something, he announced after hanging up. A property purchased 3 months ago under a corporate name. The company traces back to Arthur Morrison through a series of shell corporations. It's a remote cabin about 2 hours outside Vancouver. Is my dad there? Ruth asked, hardly daring to hope. We don't know yet. Canadian authorities are mobilizing to check it out, but the area is remote, and with this weather, he gestured to the still falling snow outside. Suddenly, all the police radios in the room crackled to life simultaneously. All units, be advised, suspect Arthur Morrison has been spotted fueling up at a gas station 50 miles from the suspected location. Subject is driving a black Ford Explorer, Canadian plates. Approach with extreme caution. Ruth felt her heart hammering in her chest. They were close, so close to finding her father. But as she looked at the grim faces of the officers around her, she realized they were all thinking the same thing. What would they find when they got to that cabin? The answer came 3 hours later when Officer Jenkins' phone rang again. The room fell silent as he listened, his expression unreadable. When he finally lowered the phone, his face broke into the first genuine smile Ruth had seen since this nightmare began. They found him, he said. Your father is alive. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Ruth sat next to Margaret on the couch, barely breathing as Officer Jenkins relayed updates from the Canadian authorities. Her father had been found drugged but conscious in the remote cabin. Arthur Morrison had been arrested trying to flee the scene. The paramedics were treating her dad for dehydration and the effects of the sedatives, but his condition was stable. When can I see him? Ruth asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and anxiety. They're lifting him to Sacred Heart Hospital in Spokane, Officer Jenkins explained. We can head there as soon as the weather clears enough for safe driving. Margaret squeezed Ruth's hand. I'll take you myself, sweetheart, first thing in the morning if the roads are passable. Ruth's mind was spinning with questions. But why did they do it? Dorothy, Elizabeth, and her brother, why did they want to hurt us? Officer Jenkins sat down across from her, his face serious. From what we've pieced together, it was about money, a lot of money. Your father had discovered some irregularities in his company's accounts. He didn't know it at the time, but Arthur Morrison had been using the company to launder money through international investments, and Dorothy was helping him. Ruth asked, though she already knew the answer. Yes, he nodded, she married your father to gain access to the company's financial records. When your father started asking questions about the suspicious transactions, they realized their scheme was about to be exposed. They needed to silence him and get access to his accounts before he could alert the authorities. Ruth felt sick. All those months of Dorothy pretending to care about her and her father had been nothing but a calculated act. Every smile, every gift, every moment of apparent kindness had been hiding this terrible truth. What about, Ruth swallowed hard, what about leaving me in the storm? Was that part of their plan too? A shadow crossed Officer Jenkins' face. According to Elizabeth's confession, she was supposed to take you to a prearranged foster home in Idaho. She claimed she panicked when she realized how much you might have overheard. Leaving you on the highway was her own decision, one she'll face additional charges for. Margaret's arm tightened around Ruth's shoulders. Thank God I drove by when I did. It wasn't just luck, Officer Jenkins said, smiling at Margaret. You've spent 30 years looking out for children in need. Some habits become instinct. The night passed slowly, despite Margaret's gentle insistence that she try to sleep. Ruth couldn't close her eyes. Every time she did, she saw Dorothy's face not as the stepmother she'd known, but as Elizabeth Morrison, the stranger who had infiltrated their lives with such calculated cruelty. Around dawn, the storm finally began to ease. Margaret brought Ruth some clean clothes that one of the officers had retrieved from her house. As she changed, Ruth caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She looked different, somehow older, perhaps, or just more aware of how complicated the world could be. The drive to Spokane took nearly 3 hours, even with a police escort. Ruth sat in Margaret's truck, watching the snow-covered landscape roll by, her heart beating faster with each mile that brought her closer to her father. Officer Jenkins followed behind them, occasionally updating them via phone about her father's condition. Finally, they pulled into the hospital parking lot. Ruth's legs felt wobbly as she walked through the automatic doors, guided by Margaret's steady hand on her shoulder. A hospital social worker met them in the lobby, along with Ms. Watson from Child Protective Services. Your father's awake, the social worker said kindly. He's been asking for you nonstop since he regained consciousness. But I should prepare you, he's still weak, and he's hooked up to various monitors. Try not to be alarmed by all the medical equipment. Ruth nodded, barely hearing the words. All she could think about was seeing her dad, making sure he was really okay. The elevator ride to the 4th floor seemed to take forever, and then suddenly she was there, standing in the doorway of his hospital room. Her father lay in the bed, looking pale and tired, with N4 in his arm and monitors beeping softly beside him. But his eyes were alert and filled with tears as they found her. Ruth, he whispered, holding out his arms. She ran to him, careful of the tubes and wires but desperate to feel his embrace. As his arms closed around her, she finally let out all the tears she'd been holding back, tears of relief, of fear, of grief for the stepmother she thought she'd known, and of joy at having her father back. I'm so sorry, he murmured into her hair. I had no idea. I should have seen. It's not your fault, Ruth said fiercely. You couldn't have known. A gentle knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Jenkins stood there, his face unusually solemn. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you both need to know. We've finished searching Elizabeth Morrison's personal effects and we found something significant. He stepped into the room, holding a familiar-looking jewelry box, the one that had belonged to Ruth's mother. She had Mom's jewelry box? Ruth asked, confused. But why? It's not about the jewelry, Officer Jenkins said quietly. It's about what we found hidden in a false bottom, documents, specifically life insurance policies on both of you. Ruth felt her father's arms tighten around her protectively as Officer Jenkins continued. They were set to pay out to Elizabeth in the event of your deaths, and they were dated from 2 months ago. The implications hung heavy in the air. Ruth's abandonment in the snowstorm hadn't been just panic or cruelty, it had been attempted murder. The hospital room fell silent after Officer Jenkins' revelation. Ruth felt her father trembling slightly as he held her, and she wasn't sure if it was from physical weakness or emotional shock. I'd like to speak with Officer Jenkins alone for a moment, her father said quietly. Ruth, honey, would you mind waiting outside with Margaret? Ruth hesitated, reluctant to leave his side even for a moment, but Margaret was already standing, holding out her hand. Come on, sweetheart. Let's get something from the cafeteria. You haven't eaten properly in days. In the hallway, Ruth found herself looking at Margaret with new eyes. "You saved my life," she said suddenly. "If you hadn't driven by when you did," Margaret's face softened. "Sometimes we're put exactly where we need to be, exactly when we need to be there." She squeezed Ruth's hand. "Though I have to admit, in 30 years of fostering, this is the first time I've been involved in uncovering a criminal conspiracy." The cafeteria was quiet at this hour. Margaret got them both hot chocolate and turkey sandwiches, insisting that Ruth eat at least half. As they sat at a corner table, Ruth finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What happens now with Dorothy, Elizabeth, and her brother?" "They'll face trial," Margaret explained gently. "The evidence against them is overwhelming: money laundering, fraud, kidnapping, attempted murder. They'll be in prison for a very long time." Ruth pushed her sandwich around on her plate. "But what about Dad and me? How do we trust people again after this?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Trust isn't an all-or-nothing thing, Ruth. What happened to you and your father was terrible, but it doesn't mean everyone in the world is untrustworthy. Look at all the people who came together to help you: Officer Jenkins, Ms. Watson, the other police officers, even the hospital staff. There's still plenty of good in the world." Their conversation was interrupted by Ms. Watson, who approached their table with a small smile. "Your father's asking for you both," she said, "and I have some paperwork we need to discuss." Back in the hospital room, Ruth found her father sitting up straighter, looking more alert despite his obvious exhaustion. Officer Jenkins was gone, but he'd left behind a stack of papers on the bedside table. "Ruth," her father said, reaching for her hand, "we need to talk about what happens next. The doctors say I'll need to stay here for at least a week while they monitor my recovery. And after that," he glanced at Ms. Watson, "we've been discussing options." Ms. Watson explained, "Given the circumstances, we believe it would be best if Ruth had a stable temporary placement while you recover, Mr. Anderson, somewhere close by so she can visit regularly." Margaret stepped forward. "I've already offered my home," she said. "If that works for everyone." Ruth looked between her father and Margaret, hope rising in her chest. The idea of staying with Margaret, who had already shown such kindness and understanding, while still being able to see her father regularly, seemed like the best possible solution. Her father nodded